Today, we are excited and honored to be speaking with Jesse Sharkey. Jesse Sharkey is the acting president of the Chicago Teachers Union, the third largest teachers local in the country, representing 30,000 Chicago public school educators. The Chicago Teachers Union, or CTU, is perhaps best known recently on a national level for leading a teacher strike in 2012 that mobilized much of the city against the corporate-driven policies of Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel. Jesse Sharkey, welcome to Flashpoints, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, Ken, thanks for having me on. And I just want to say a couple of things real quickly. First of all, I know that many people are aware Karen Lewis has become seriously ill. She's the president. And we've gotten from all over the country, including from the Bay Area, calls, emails with well wishes, with prayers, and that's very much appreciated. And also, there was a lot of support that came in from people in the labor movement who cared about teaching in general a couple of years ago during the strike, and we appreciate that as well. So, and thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. And Karen Lewis has a lot of admirers and supporters, not only here in the Bay Area, but among our listeners around the country. So please give her our best thoughts and wishes and let her know that we're thinking about her. Let me ask you to start by telling us a little bit more about what's important to know about you personally and the work that you've done in education and social justice.
Okay. I'm the vice president of the CTU. I'm filling in Karen's duties right now while she's healing. The CTU is the third biggest teachers union in the country. We represent about 25,000 active teachers, school employees, clerks, classroom assistants, and whatnot in the Chicago public school system. We have been much more active union in the last few years, have worked very hard to build a coalition with parents, students, members of the community, sort of viewing education as a social justice issue and saying that the union needs to be a leader in that regard, and not just sort of focus narrowly on the sort of business contractual relations, but to see education as a social movement. And we started that off in 2010 when we took over the union. Prior to that, I spent more than a decade as a high school history teacher in the city. That's how I got to know Karen and a number of other people who are involved in this work. We were just the activists who would show up when the Board of Education here would go to close the school, or when some corporate reformer would come in and start telling lies about about our public education system. We'd go to that. We got to know each other, and we decided to take over our union and change it. So, in a nutshell, that's the kind of place that I'm coming from, and I'm happy to be able to keep the struggle going forward.
All right. Well, we actually want to go a bit more into that history in depth. So we are actually spending a lot of time in the Flashpoints education series critiquing that corporate education agenda, which includes privatization, school closings, attacks on teachers and their unions, high-stakes standardized testing and curriculum, among other features. And from what I understand, many of the corporate-driven policies were actually field-tested in Chicago a decade and a half ago by Arne Duncan, the current Secretary of Education, before he was appointed by President Obama. Can you talk to us about how the corporate education agenda was rolled out in Chicago and the role that Arne Duncan played in that?
Sure, I can. Arne Duncan was the CEO of the public schools in Chicago starting in 2002. That model itself goes back a few years earlier than that. The person who was the first CEO of the public schools here was Paul Vallis. Paul Vallis later went on to run the public schools in Philadelphia. I should say, run them into the ground. He then from there he went to turn all the schools in New Orleans into charter schools after Katrina. So. But Arne Duncan really was the main protagonist in this drama about the way public schools would run in the city. He had, like I said, CEO powers. The mayor in Chicago won in the late 90s the right to appoint a school board. So there was a very corporate school board which backed up the CEO. Arnie Duncan he did not have a background as a teacher or a person who spent a lot of time in a classroom. He'd been an education consultant, and he implemented a very corporate model of education in the city, one which really tried to take sort of the idea of test score-based competition, where you make competitions between schools based on how well they could do on standardized assessments, what the students could do on standardized assessments, and you would use that kind of competition to decide which schools would open and which schools would remain open and which schools would be closed. There are a number of features to that. There's a lot of demonization of sort of low-performing schools, which not surprising. I think when school probation first started in the late 90s, there were something in the order of 90 schools on probation. By the time Arnie Duncan was done with it, we had 300-some schools on probation. They were constantly sort of making it more difficult for schools to stay out of academic trouble. And, of course, it was the poorest schools. It was the schools in the neighborhoods where kids' parents didn't have jobs, didn't have stable places to live, were suffering lots of instability. Those, of course, turned out to be the neighborhoods where the test scores were the weakest. And rather than having real supports and helping those schools become stable in places that could thrive, Arnie Duncan began a program where those schools were closed. And with that, many of the skilled veteran educators that had been kept the schools going for years were fired. The school system in Chicago went from a school system where 40-some% of our teachers were African American to a school system now where something in the order of 20% of our teachers are African Americans. We lost more than half of our black teachers.
Wow.
And what they've done is they've closed schools as they've replaced them with privately operated charter schools, many of whom in Chicago are politically connected. And so there are now 130 separate charter campuses operating across the city. Of course, those schools that have not been performing better than the public schools which they replaced. But those schools have been part of, I'd argue, a kind of a very politicized attempt to undercut the system of labor relations, and that's really what it was more about, and have been very much a part of an attempt to just apply some nostrums from the free market to say, hey, look, if we do free market ideas, that's what's going to fix our schools. And so that was the legacy of Arnie Duncan, and he stayed here all the way through Obama's election in 2008 when he became the Secretary of Education.
Let's talk now about the Chicago Teachers Union, the third largest teachers local in the country. And my understanding is that there was a struggle within the CTU, and a more activist, social justice-oriented caucus took leadership of the union in 2010. That caucus is named CORE, which stands for the Caucus of Rank-and-File Educators. Can you tell us more about CORE's concept of social justice unionism and how you were able to win the leadership of the union at that time?
I can. It's the heart of what sort of me and a group of other people in CORE thought is that it was really limiting to just view education and teachers unionism as something which can be encapsulated as sort of business terms in an employment contract. Not that what's an employment contract isn't important. It is, because it represents an important way to influence sort of the terms and conditions of work. But the schools are a lot more than that. They're important community resources. Schools they're a nexus where people in the community come together with students, with parents, with teachers. On a given day, there'll be 1,000 souls in and out of a school building. And that people's desire for good education really that's a site of real potential solidarity between teachers and everyone else, parents and students in particular, people in the community. And we just thought that the union had to become really committed to finding common cause common ground in making making the demand for good schools into something which was the forefront of everything that we stood for, and spend some time listening to what folks in the community wanted to do in the way that they understood sort of the struggle for good schools, and that if we did that together, it would make all of us more effective.
All right. Now, CTU is best known nationally for, or recently anyway, best known nationally for leading the teacher strike in 2012 against Mayor Rahm Emanuel's policy. Rahm Emanuel was President Obama's former chief of staff and a former investment banker. Talk to us about some of the issues that led up to the strike in 2012.
Sure. Rahm has also gone around claiming credit for Race to the Top, which is the Obama administration's sort of education plan, which I sort of call sort of cash prizes for union busting. It starves school districts of funds, except if they're willing to allow for charter expansion, over-testing, the same kind of marketplace-driven competitive strategies that I would say were so harmful in Chicago. They've now taken it on a national scale. And so, Rahm was really a promoter of this exact kind of education reform when he was in D.C., and that's what he brought to Chicago, which of course wasn't completely new. But what Rahm did is he brought a kind of hard-knuckled impatience, and took our school day, for example, and declared that he was going to increase it by over 20% in terms of how long it would be. But would do that with no increase in funds going into the schools. He tried to push through a law in Springfield, which in his opinion would make it virtually impossible for teachers to strike in Chicago, and therefore he thought that would ensure that he could get all the changes that he wanted, without having any meaningful opposition from the union. He turned out to be wrong about that, but that certainly was part of the plan. When his team set up the negotiations, they took they hacked through. They wanted to just take out literally hundreds of provisions that had been, that defended things like class size. All the class size language that was in our contract, they wanted to remove it. The board wanted to really kind of radically reshape schools in the city. They wanted to, for example, take half of a teacher's evaluation and tie it to the standardized test scores of their students, which would essentially ensure that our schools would become test prep factories as parent-led teachers ran around trying to make sure their kids did as well as possible on these tests, because the teachers' own careers would depend on that. In an example after example, the mayor really set the stage for a big, bitter showdown over the schools.
Now, what was the union strategy during the strike? You've referenced it a little bit in terms of core general approach, but what were some of the ways that you were able to organize and mobilize not only teachers, but also parents and students and community members?
Well, the first thing that was really important for us as a union is that we didn't try to take the social issues around schooling and treat them like isolated issues that didn't come into the contract. And so right before we went into the most intense part of bargaining in the spring of 2012, that was the most intense, but right before bargaining really got going in earnest, the board announced that it was going to close about 20 schools. This was sort of in preparation for the huge school closings a couple of years later. And this is in the winter of 11-12. And, we had a very good idea that the board was going to go through with this. It was going to be voted on by an appointed board of education. We didn't necessarily think that we were going to be able to stop it, but we decided to fight very hard anyway. There were marches, there were demonstrations, there was even a school occupation. Where people refused to leave a school on the eve of the board's vote, and the point of that was just to say that was to show really the union could make common cause with parents, particularly in Black and Latino communities in the city who are being targeted, who are really being targeted by these school closings, and that we would make a stand to say that really we want investment in our schools, in the divestment in the school system, the neglect that we're getting for the schools, the free market solutions where they're offering kids a choice at a charter school as opposed to a high-quality public neighborhood school, which is what parents actually wanted, that wasn't going to be acceptable. And we used harsh language. We said that their closing policy was racist. We said that we would fight it. And even though we lost that closing vote, I think we began to make a point and began to win some respect in a lot of the communities in the city of Chicago who actually send their kids to public school. And so what it meant is that when we went into the fall of 2012 and we wound up not being able to get an agreement and have to go on strike, there were very deep reserves of public support for what we had to say and the kind of issues that we were complaining about. And so, I think the board, I think at one point after the strike, the CEO of schools at the time, this guy Jean-Claude Bizard, who was fired after the strike, but I think what he said is that we severely underestimated the ability of the union to lead a mass movement against us. And that's really what happened, is that there was really a movement for public schools, and the board had too much hubris and too many blind spots to see that coming.
Mm. And what was the outcome of the strike at that time? What did you gain and what did you have to give up?
I mean, honestly, the strike did not reverse corporate school reform. And, we've often said that you have to look at the strike in terms of things that we won, things that we stopped, and things that we couldn't stop. So we won some things. For example, we won the right to appeal our ratings. So in the past, if you had a rating and you were a teacher in Chicago and you didn't like your rating, that was tough. That was the principal's the final word on that. Well, now that your rating can be appealed, and we've overturned a number of ratings that weren't fair along this line. Not the most earth-shattering thing in the world, but, more than nothing. We managed to stop them from removing the class size language in our contract. And despite the deficient, that isn't a perfect language, and class sizes aren't as small as they should be. I think the class size calls for a maximum class size of 28 in Chicago. In the elementary, young elementary and high school grades, which is, smaller than California, but, not perfect. But we stopped them from removing it. We stopped them from getting 50% of the teacher's evaluation based on test score. There are a number of measures, one of which is now a standardized test, and in many areas, like in high school and in early childhood, that's 5%. The other tests that are used to look at teachers are tests which teachers themselves give, and it's capped at 30%. And then there's some things we couldn't stop. We couldn't stop the 7-hour school day. It wasn't 7 hours and 40 minutes, but the school day got a lot longer. We got the board to promise to do a bunch of hiring, so that they hired 700 new teachers to help with that new longer day. And then in subsequent years with budget shortfalls, they fired a lot of those teachers. They laid them off. So, if you asked a teacher on balance, is their life better now than it was before the strike, I think most teachers would tell you no. That school has, if anything, gotten worse. It's gotten more stressful. The workload is more impossible and more daunting. And, I'm not so sure you could say that was that things got worse because of the strike. I think you'd say that things got worse despite the strike. And so at the end of the day, and that's kind of the assessment that I'd give.
All right. Now, while you may not have won everything that you wanted to, a lot of activists around the country were inspired by what they saw as the emergence of a mass social justice unionism at that time. Can you say a little about some of the kinds of support you got around the country?
The outpouring of support, whether it was in the form of letters or checks, the union got a couple $100,000 of donations during the course of that strike, was really quite inspiring. And it reminded me that people care a lot about their schools, that the movement towards corporate school reform is not a popular one, especially not among the people who see it most up close. I mean, I'm convinced that, it's the people who don't have kids in public schools, or don't work in one, who are the most in favor of this set of ideas. And I think it's just very important for everyone to remember that, we get this idea that we're isolated and that our ideas are wrong and unpopular, or maybe not they're wrong, but certainly they're unpopular. And that's not really what we've seen in Chicago. What we've seen in Chicago is that when we take the time to build alliances, that our ideas are popular, and that we can win political fights.
Mm-hmm. And if you were just going to summarize in maybe a couple of key points what the main lessons from the strike are for those who oppose the corporate education agenda and support a more social justice education, how would you summarize the main lessons?
That unions are important, but they have to make common cause with parents and their communities. That we have to fight for our ideas and what we believe in. And that when we fight, we can win.
All right. Now, what has been happening in Chicago schools since the strike?
Since the strike, the schools really have maintained a course that they had sort of adopted when the mayor Emanuel came in, which is that there's continued to be a lot of aggressive privatization. So, for example, the Board of Education handed over its the contracts for cleaning and doing custodial work in schools to a couple of corporations. You might have heard of Aramark, which is a big national cleaning company, and I think that the board claimed they were going to save $50 or $60 million in the cost of cleaning the schools. The Aramark claimed that they were going to do that by bringing in machinery like Zambonis and whatnot that would allow us to clean schools more efficiently. The big machines that look like the ice cleaning machine that drive along and sweep and squeegee floors automatically, and that they could use less staff in these schools because of that. And this has been a disaster. Most of our schools don't have elevators, and when they do have elevators, the elevators aren't of a capacity to actually lift up the Zambonis. So they bring in Zambonis, and you got a 3-floor school, and you can't use it anything to actually clean the second and third floors. And but Aramark cut all the staff that were needed to clean these buildings, and so there has been nightmare after nightmare of filthy schools that don't have soap or paper towels in the washrooms, schools where the trash is getting emptied from classrooms once a week. And in Chicago, we have breakfast in the classrooms. So there's food waste all in the school, and there's rat and mouse droppings, and there's no soap or towels in the bathroom, and you just get the idea that this has been a real disaster in a number of places. But and I could go on and on. There's been a real problem, a real aggressive approach to cost cutting, round after round of layoffs. I think we've laid off something like 3,500 school staff since the mayor has been in. In terms of the way the schools are managed, schools are now given a pot of money, and each principal has to sort of hustle and try to find cheaper ways to staff their building because the pot of money isn't sufficient to cover the staffing needs of the school. So we're seeing principals in many cases target veteran teachers because veteran teachers are more expensive to hire. They have more skills. They make more. But in some cases, if a principal can figure out a way to lay off an experienced veteran with 2 master's degrees, they can hire 2 brand new teachers out of college for the same price. And so we're seeing a lot of violations of people's rights in the school, and we don't think that any of those kind of measures makes things better for students. We think those kind of changes make things cheaper for the people who run the school system, and we've seen a real lack of willingness to address any of the revenue needs of the schools at a city level. It's just come out, for example, that the Board of Education made $400 million worth of bad derivatives trades and investments starting in the mid-2000s, or starting in the early 2000s up until the mid-2000s, where they did things like took swaptions, toxic swaps, in which they agreed to trade fixed market bond issues for floating bond issues, and got involved in some very complicated financial derivatives products, which they took out just before the markets crashed, and the banks got a huge windfall profit to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, and at the same time that you had bankers pocketing these tens of millions of dollars, you had those same bankers on boards telling the people of Chicago that we had to close 50 schools because the board didn't have enough money to be able to keep them open.
Wow.
If you can imagine.
That is unbelievable.
It's so bold. It's crazy. It's the kind of thing that that you almost can't believe how brazen and shocking it is. You're talking about a mayor who brags about how powerful and effective he is and how he gets things done, but he's how tough he is. But his toughness is really our tough luck. Mm-hmm. But he's never tough with the people who, the people here in Chicago, the financial districts called LaSalle Street, and the traders on LaSalle Street pay less taxes on the transactions that you or I would pay if we went and got a cheeseburger at McDonald's. And yet that's allowed to just continue on. No, we can't tax them. But I guess we can lay off thousands of people out of our school systems.
Right. Now, what is the union focusing on in the next year and the long term? What's the union's agenda at this point?
Well, a couple of things right now. Our contract expires at the end of this year, and we need a new one. And the other thing is that the mayor's contract expires in February, and we need a new one of those too. And there's been some very interesting processes going on inside the CTU. One of which is that when the board closed, and I don't know if your listeners have heard much about this, but in 2013, in the winter of 2013, the Board of Education closed 50 Chicago schools, which is the largest single school closings anywhere except maybe in the way public schools were wiped out in New Orleans after Katrina. And because that was done not through the school contract but through the mayor's office and with a political decision, we have many, many members who've now turned their attention to city council and local municipal politics. And that's been a very interesting process to sort of go through from my vantage point as a person who helps run the union. There's a lot of difficulties about electoral politics. It's not exactly as if it's a place that, where our union is most comfortable. It's a place where money and media really play an outsized influence. And, we're talking about school teachers running for city council. Our own president, before she was sick, was trying to get on the ballot to become mayor. And so that's sort of new territory, but in a way it highlights how much many teachers took a political lesson out of some of the defeats that we've seen in the last couple of years. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing I'll say is just that we are very, we're very focused. We're doing the kind of work internally and externally with our community partners that we need to do to get a new contract, and that involves going around throughout the school system and holding meetings both in communities and with our members, talking about what kinds of things they'd like to see in the schools. We're putting together bargaining documents. We have numerous meetings to review those proposals, and official negotiations have begun as well.
Mm-hmm. What do you believe is most important for supporters of social justice education to be doing now, whether or not they're educators, just from wherever they are positioned?
Well, I think one area where people need to pay attention is testing. I think that what's going on right now with standardized tests is really an outrage, and I think it would be, it's an area where people who are parents, especially, you don't have to be a teacher, but if you've got a kid in the public schools or any school, you should be outraged about what they're trying to do with this new PARC test, which is the Partnership Assessment for Readiness for Careers in College, and it's a 9-hour test. It's given to every student every year between kindergarten and 8th grade. And talking about a high school version as well, and so you're talking about a test that's longer than the law boards and the MCAT combined, and you're giving it to 3rd graders.
Wow!
And there's no other country in the world that does this with kids. It's insane. It will really have a big and deep harmful effect on our education. So I would urge people to take a look at that. And then, for people who don't have kids in schools and maybe testing seems like a kind of an obscure issue, I think that our movement needs to continue to really focus on the question of revenue and the question of the way public services in general, but education in particular, are funded or in many cases not funded in this country. So, it's just not possible to create a high quality school system when you're starving it for funds. But I will say this, that part of what social justice unionism is about on some basic level, as far as I'm concerned, is to understand that people who care, who are in a community, who are involved in movements for, to fight for better conditions in their own part of the world, really are a very important resource, and we have to try to make common cause with those movements. And I'll give an example. In Chicago, there are people who are very concerned about how racist the criminal justice system can be, and how unresponsive it is, and how much easier it is for a kid to get negative attention from a cop or, frankly, from a teacher sometimes than it is to get positive attention. And so, there are people doing work around justice in schools, and that's something which is very important. Trying to do some work to look at the way we do student discipline, for example. There's people. The union brought a bus to Ferguson. And I know a lot of people in the country are beginning to talk about that, and that's been something that is, that we think is part of what it means to be responsive to the needs of others. You could go on and on. People choose the issue of homelessness, and that's the biggest. There's 20,000 homeless students in the city of Chicago who go to school, and we need to pay attention to what's going on there. That's an important voice. So, I maybe this is getting to be a rambling list, but people need to form. People who are in the unions need to try to form contacts and make common cause with people who are outside the unions, and people who are outside the unions need to be do the same thing, inside the education movement. And if people in the union don't seem to want to pay attention, try to find other educators who do. I promise they're out there.
Yeah, thank you for that. No, there are clearly many, many things people can do wherever they are located. Let me ask you what makes you most concerned about the future of education and what makes you the most hopeful.
The thing that concerns me most about the future of public education is that I think there's a chance that there won't be public education, at least not in the way that we recognize it. You go back to Horace Mann in the 1840s talking about there being a compulsory, non-sectarian, and free education system. I'm not sure we keep that if we if public school systems become portfolio systems where you've got a handful of public schools competing with a big group of privately operated schools, in which individual parents can take vouchers and bring those vouchers to sectarian or religious schools. So I'm very worried about the future of the system. I think that it's existed for a long time, but it's not. The public schools have existed for a long time, but they've always been very subject to be affected by the political passions of the moment. And so during the Cold War, the Cold War sort of worked its way into the schools, and during the nativist, anti-immigrant kind of fears of the early 20th century, that kind of Americanism, worked its way into the schools. And our schools are, I'm not going to say they're fragile, but they are susceptible to the political trends in the country. And if we have a long enough sustained kind of political trend that has to do with sort of denigrating public institutions and emphasizing above all the need to have private markets and private institutions that compete for profit, and we apply that to the schools in an ideological and rigid enough way, we will do in the public school system. And that is something which is, I think, a very scary thought.
Mm-hmm. Now,
that's my fear.
All right. And then what about what makes you most hopeful about the future of education?
The thing that makes me most hopeful is that everything I've seen in the last several years tells me that this is going to be a much more two-sided process than any corporate privatizer is counting on. And that there's no way that people are going to let that happen to the public schools without a fight. No way. People care about their schools. We can be told our schools are failure factories and they need to be shut down, and people might even agree with that in the abstract. But when someone tells you that it's your school's turn to be shut down, and your kid is going to lose all the friends and people who they got to know, and the school that's in your community that had been a bedrock of the neighborhood, and is going to be closed, and you risk losing things that you care about, then suddenly people wake up, and when they try to push those changes hard and fast enough, it produces a backlash politically. And I have a lot of faith that people aren't stupid about this stuff. People are going to start connecting the dots and opposing what I really view as overreach on the part of corporate privatizers.
Mm-hmm. Very well said. Anything else that you want to address that we haven't covered today?
I think that's about it. I appreciate the chance to. I appreciate the chance to talk about some of this stuff. I will say one other thought, which is just that one of the things which I always thought was a really strong, a real strength of the public school system in the U.S. is that it reflected a lot of the ideas of the civil rights movement. It reflected a lot of things of the sort of the high water mark of sort of celebrating people's rights and people's heritage. And it had especially in the cities, our public schools, when I first started teaching in them in the late 90s, still had a lot of character that was left over from the civil rights movement, from the Latino power movement, etc. And that is something which corporate reform is just driving out as fast as it can. It's, the sort of the rhetoric about our schools need to have more rigor. Our schools need to make kids ready for college and career. Is something which it's a very deceptively packaged little piece, because it's pretty hard to disagree with the idea that kids should be well educated. But then there's a kind of interesting flip, which is that suddenly being culturally aware, being proud of your heritage, being able to have a multicultural society where that's diverse, those things are certainly not part of what it means to be well prepared. And now we're going to measure being well prepared by how high how high of a MAP score you have in math, reading, and writing. And there's a problem with that, which is that MAP scores in math, reading, and writing, really tend more than anything else to track class and socioeconomic status.
Mm-hmm.
So we're erasing a whole set of things that were meant to sort of be something which the student our students in the city, the least among us, could identify with, feel proud of, feel like it was something for them, and replacing it with a measure which is something which is, I'm not going to say it's not important, but it leaves an awful lot out. So I don't know. That's another thought.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's one of the things that is so insidious is that the corporatizers have really mastered the language of reform, and it takes some digging to actually get down underneath what that really is and see the ways that it co-opts progressive directions into some very harmful consequences.
Right. As if we measure, Martin Luther King Jr.'s verbal ability by his GRE score.
Right. Right. Exactly. All right.
Yeah.
Well, our guest today has been Jesse Sharkey, acting president of the Chicago Teachers Union, which represents 30,000 Chicago public school educators and has offered an inspiring model of social justice unionism in recent years. Jesse, we want to thank you so much for sharing your insight, your wisdom, and your inspiration with us today, and wish you all the best of luck.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Thank you, Jesse.